In today's episode, I'm going to tell you 3 true stories about people who made choices that are so shocking, you'll find yourself leaning in closer just to make sure you heard that right. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please break into the like button's car and remove their steering wheel. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One weekday morning in March of 1995, a man named Luther Charles sat on the porch of his parents' house in St. Louis, Missouri, while holding a newspaper. Both of Luther's parents were at work, but Luther was not, because he didn't have a job. In fact, he hadn't had a single job in the last 5 years. So Luther desperately wanted to be an actor professionally. And he'd spent the last 5 years, not working, but auditioning constantly and getting rejected over and over and over again. Now he was totally broke and living with his parents, but he had not lost the dream of wanting to be an actor. Now, Luther knew that a lot of people, at least outside of the acting world, thought that trying to be an actor was sort of a pipe dream. Only chosen few get to do that professionally at a high level. And that he, Luther, should be more realistic and just get a normal job, especially after 5 years of attempts that didn't work out. But he just couldn't bring himself to do that, because for him it was going to be acting or nothing. So on this particular morning, he was doing what he did almost every single day, which was flipping through the classified section of the newspaper, looking for any open calls for auditions. And as he scanned the page he was on, he saw one that caught his eye. It was for a musical that was being produced several hundred miles away in Ohio, but they had an open call for auditions that night. Now, at first, Luther was kind of confused about why producers from Ohio would place a call for auditions in a newspaper in Missouri. But then he saw that it was because these producers were trying to find a very specific kind of actor for what sounded like a very unique character. And Luther realized he could be what they were looking for. This could finally be his chance to get his big break. This was, of course, not going to be easy. Number one, he would have to drive today all the way to Ohio just to do this audition. But 2, what it would take for him to get into this character, to do a good job and hopefully land this part, was going to take a lot. But after 5 years of near constant rejection, he was willing to try anything. A few minutes later, Luther got into the driver's seat of his car. He was carrying 3 things with him: a map to help him get to Ohio, an entire bottle of whiskey to help him be brave, and a hacksaw to help him get into character. That evening in Ohio, one of the producers of this musical sat in the front row of an empty auditorium. She'd spent the last several hours listening to hopeful actors read monologues and sing songs, and she knew there were still more people waiting to audition. So she called for the next person in line to come inside. And a moment later, a man stumbled out onto the stage, and when the producer saw him, she was just confused because he seemed very wobbly, almost like he was drunk, and he had on this weird sort of costume where he had bandages wrapped around his head. And then, in a very slurred voice, this man said his name was Luther Charles, and he knew that this musical required a very specific kind of actor, and he had made sure that he was perfect for this part. The producer didn't understand what Luther was talking about, though. But before she could clarify, Luther, on stage, began unwrapping the bandages from his head. And when the producer saw what was underneath them, she began screaming for help. It would turn out that casting call in the newspaper that Luther read that inspired him to go here and do this contained a very unfortunate typo. What the producers of the musical were looking for were genuine, fearless actors. But what actually got printed was a call for, quote, genuine, earless actors. And Luther Charles was so desperate to land a role that he drove to Ohio, downed a bottle of whiskey, and then cut off both of his ears with that hacksaw because he believed it would make him perfect for this musical. Luther survived his self-inflicted injuries and later underwent psychiatric treatment. He did not, however, get the part. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. The strangest part isn't coming home. It's realizing you came back, but your mind didn't. You're trying to move through life doing everything right, work, family, responsibilities. But small moments feel off, and later you're left thinking, what's wrong with me? I also went through these exact same feelings when I left the military. My mind was very conflicted because the world sort of expected me to be normal, but it was like my nervous system still expected danger all the time. Trauma doesn't stay back there. It rewires you. It changes how you react, how you trust, how you love. But therapy can help break that pattern. BetterHelp makes that support easier to access. You fill out a short questionnaire and get matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a couple of days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch anytime. Join the 6 million plus people who have gotten help from BetterHelp, the platform you can trust. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy. On an evening in October of 2003, a woman named Tina carried a grocery bag down the hallway of a big apartment building in Harlem, New York. The hallway was narrow, with white tile walls and heavy metal doors and overhead lights that flickered. And as Tina stopped in front of her door, she caught a whiff of a familiar smell coming from across the hall in apartment 5E. It smelled like urine and rotting meat. Tina grimaced, but quickly set down her grocery bag and began sifting through her purse for her keys. But right as she found them, she heard footsteps coming down the hall behind her. She turned, and when she saw who was walking up the hallway towards her, she began to panic because it was Antoine Yates, the owner of apartment 5E, the stinky apartment. He was coming right down the hall, and he was carrying what appeared to be this huge sack that maybe looked like it was filled with sand or something. She didn't care, but she did not want to be near this guy. And so as fast as she could, she put the key in the door, opened it up, flew inside, grabbed her groceries, shut the door, and deadbolted it. Now, Tina did feel sort of guilty about being really obviously rude towards Antoine. I mean, Antoine had lived in this building for years, and at one point she had thought he was a nice guy. But lately, he'd gotten really weird, and she no longer wanted anything to do with him. First of all, there was that horrific smell coming from his apartment basically at all hours. And then there was the fact that Antoine basically stopped leaving the apartment altogether. Like he was basically in his apartment 24/7. As far as Tina could tell, he maybe left once a day, tops, for maybe like an hour a day. But other than that, he was like a constant presence across the hall. But beyond the smell and his reclusive nature, the most sort of alarming aspect of his recent weird behavior were all the random loud crashing sounds that Tina would hear coming from Antoine's apartment at all hours, even though from what she could tell, he didn't have any visitors ever. It was just him in there. Now, Tina had no idea what Antoine was doing in there, but she assumed whatever it wasn't good, but it wasn't her business. And so she decided that the best thing she could do was just stay in her apartment, make sure the door was locked, and hope at some point he stopped doing whatever it was he was doing. A couple days later, Tina went down to the lobby to check her mail. And when she did, she ran into a woman named Joyce who lived in apartment 4E, which was directly below Antoine's apartment. Tina said hello to her, and as she opened up her mailbox, Joyce came over and stood next to her with this sort of strange look on her face. Tina picked up on it and asked her what was wrong. And Joyce told her that last night she'd noticed liquid dripping down through her ceiling. And at first she thought it was maybe a burst pipe or an overflowing sink. But when she got a rag and went to clean it up, she realized it wasn't water. It smelled like pee. Then Joyce, she lowered her voice and leaned in close to Tina. And she said the pee wasn't the only weird thing. Sometimes late at night, when the building was quiet, she said she could hear what sounded like whimpering coming from the upstairs apartment, Antoine's apartment. And at this, Tina's heart began to pound. Now, she had tried to just kind of, mentally and physically avoid the whole Antoine situation, whatever it was. But now that she knew other neighbors were also noticing bizarre things like she was, she felt like she had to act. And so Tina said to Joyce that, you know what, we really ought to call the housing authority and see if they'd come out and investigate to see what was going on. But Joyce said she'd already tried that. She'd called multiple times, and so far, nobody had done anything. So Tina told Joyce that, okay, well, let's all get together, all the other neighbors, and go to the housing authority as a group. And maybe then they'd be taken more seriously. Joyce liked the idea, so the two women exchanged numbers, and then Tina went back up to her apartment. But the next day, before Tina had time to chat with any more neighbors, she came home from the store and walked into the lobby of the apartment building, and she saw Antoine on the floor of the lobby screaming in pain with two police officers huddled over him. He had these gaping wounds all over his arm and his leg, and there was blood all over the tile floor. Tina didn't know what to do, so she just hustled right past them through the lobby, made her way upstairs, and got inside her apartment. But once she was inside, her curiosity got the best of her, and she ran to the window to see if there was anything going on outside that could begin to explain what was going on with Antoine. And outside, she saw an ambulance pull up, and then moments later, paramedics loaded Antoine into the back of it, and they took off. After that, Tina basically sat there expecting any moment for the police to come barreling down the hallway and break down Antoine's door, apartment 5E, to finally put an end to whatever was happening inside of there. But she sat there waiting for an hour, and she didn't hear anything. And then finally, after, about an hour, she saw those two police officers from the lobby get back in their squad car and drive away. Tina was shocked. She had no idea what happened to Antoine, but she also couldn't conceptualize of what Antoine would have told those officers that would make them think they should just leave without checking his apartment. And so Tina felt like she couldn't just sit here and do nothing, like somebody needed to go in there. Tina didn't know if maybe Antoine was hurting someone in his apartment and they had finally fought back, that's why he was all cut up, or maybe if he was involved in some kind of violent criminal activity or what, but it was clearly never going to end unless she spoke up. So, as much as it terrified her to get involved here, she picked up the phone, called the police, and told them everything she had seen and heard. The next day, Tina was coming home from work when she saw this huge crowd gathered outside her apartment building. Hundreds of her neighbors were just standing on the sidewalk looking up at the side of the building. And when Tina looked up, she saw what they were watching. A police officer was rappelling down the side of this building from one of the upper levels, and with him he had this big rifle and some other huge weapon, and he was slowly making his way down. But then he eventually stopped right outside a 5th floor window. And Tina realized he was stopping outside of Antoine's window. That was his apartment. And so Tina and the others watched as this officer began to tap on the glass of the window. And then there was this huge explosion of glass that flew outwards, like the window had broken, but from the inside going out. That officer immediately raised his rifle and began firing into the apartment while also signaling to the police officers above him, leaning out of another apartment to pull him up. And they immediately began pulling him up. And then a few minutes later, a half dozen more police officers came running out the front door of the apartment building, and they were carrying this massive tarp between them with something obviously very heavy and large inside of it. Now, none of this made any sense to Tina until the officers passed by her and she caught a glimpse of what was in the tarp. It would turn out Tina and Joyce were right to be suspicious of Antoine. But it wasn't because he was a violent criminal who was secretly hurting people in his apartment. No, his secret was actually much weirder. Antoine had a very strange pet. Specifically, he had a 400-pound tiger named Ming, who had been living in Antoine's apartment for years. It slept in one of his bedrooms with a giant sand pit. It peed basically everywhere, and it lived off raw meat. Antoine's horrible wounds that day were caused by Ming biting him when Antoine tried to stop the tiger from pouncing on one of his other pets, a stray kitten that he had taken in. As for Antoine and Ming, they both survived this encounter, Antoine was ultimately arrested for reckless endangerment, and Ming, who was just tranquilized during that exchange with the police officer, was carried out of the apartment and taken to a sanctuary in Ohio. Also, that stray kitten survived the attack as well. At 2:45 p.m. on January 6, 1995, a 45-year-old man named MacArthur Wheeler walked towards the front doors of a bank in Swissvale, Pennsylvania, which is a small town near Pittsburgh. MacArthur had on a mask and was dressed in a big blue parka, and in one of his pockets, he was carrying a semi-automatic handgun. MacArthur was about to rob this bank at gunpoint, but weirdly, he did not feel nervous, despite the fact that, MacArthur had never robbed a bank before. But one of his friends, 43-year-old Clifton Johnson, had. And Clifton was already inside the bank, waiting in line and pretending to be a customer, even though he was actually MacArthur's co-conspirator. MacArthur and Clifton had spent days planning out this robbery together, down to every last detail. And even though MacArthur had been kind of scared at first, Clifton had talked him through every possible scenario and made sure that they had a plan for everything that could go wrong. So now, MacArthur was 100% confident that they were going to get away with this, which again is why he was not nervous. So, this day, MacArthur walked up to the bank's doors and went inside. He had to squint through his mask because it obscured his view a little bit, but he saw Clifton standing in line, which immediately gave him another burst of confidence to actually see Clifton. He was here. So far, things were going exactly as planned. And so MacArthur quickly pushed his way through the line, and he locked eyes with the bank teller. And as he did, he pulled out his gun, he aimed it at them, and he told them to hand over all the money. MacArthur heard the sound of other people in the bank, other patrons and other staff beginning to gasp because they're seeing what's happening here. And so MacArthur quickly turned around with his gun still in his hand, and he told everybody that he didn't want to hurt anyone. Everybody just needed to stay calm, and as soon as he got the money, he'd be gone. Then MacArthur turned back to the teller, who by this point had gathered up all the cash in the register and was literally just holding it out, like, here, take it. And MacArthur, he grabbed the cash, put it in one of his pockets, he put his gun back inside of his pocket, then he looked over at Clifton, and the two men nodded, and then they turned and ran out of the bank. About 3 months later, in the early morning hours of April 20th, 1995, MacArthur was sleeping inside his apartment just outside of Pittsburgh. After the robbery, he and Clifton had escaped with a little over $5,000, and they'd gone their separate ways in order to lay low. So they weren't really in contact, but to MacArthur, it seemed like everything had worked out perfectly, because here he was, still a free man with all this cash, and the cops hadn't even shown up once to question him. But on this particular night, a pounding on MacArthur's door woke him up, and he bolted upright in bed, and he heard somebody yell at him to open up, because it was the police. Now at this point, MacArthur was definitely nervous. However, he sort of calmed himself down and told himself that right now his best option was just to play it cool. Because even if the cops suspected him in that robbery, there was simply no way they could possibly prove he'd actually done it. He'd been wearing a mask and a huge parka that totally obscured his identity. So MacArthur, he got out of bed and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and sure enough, there's all these police officers standing in the doorway. And MacArthur pretended to act confused and asked them, what's going on here? And that was when one of the officers told MacArthur he was under arrest for armed robbery, and then showed him a printed photo from one of the bank's security cameras, and clear as day, there he was. So this photo clearly showed MacArthur's face. Every detail was perfectly visible. It was him, for sure. He didn't even look like he was wearing a mask. But MacArthur couldn't wrap his mind around how this was possible. He looked from the picture up to the cops and just said, "But I wore the juice." It would turn out the mask MacArthur was wearing during this robbery was not a ski mask or a Halloween mask or really a mask in any traditional sense of the word. What MacArthur and his co-conspirator Clifton had both done, and what they truly thought would disguise their identities completely, was rub lemon juice on their faces. They believed that lemon juice would essentially act as a mask and make them literally invisible to security cameras. Unfortunately though, lemon juice does not make you invisible. And so once the police accessed the bank's security footage, they saw clear as day MacArthur and Clifton committing this crime, and they arrested them both. Clifton was sentenced to 5 years in prison for armed bank robbery, and MacArthur was sentenced to 22.5 years. But this was not the end of the story, because Clifton and MacArthur's ridiculous crime made headlines. And before long, a professor of social psychology at Cornell University read about it, and it made him realize something. The fact that MacArthur literally believed lemon juice would make him invisible, and he acted on that knowledge, or that supposed knowledge, to commit this crime, and then was shocked when it didn't work, that suggests a level of stupidity that is just exceptionally high. So high that this professor began to wonder if maybe MacArthur is so stupid, he actually doesn't understand how stupid he really was. And so this led the professor to research this idea, and he ultimately established a new psychological concept that we now call the Dunning-Kruger effect, which essentially says that the more incompetent a person is at something, the less likely they are to recognize their own incompetence. Basically, the dumber you are, the more confident you become. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.